Yes, so now we're going to kick off with our panel discussion. And for that, I'm going to introduce you Ian Glacken. He's a geologist and an executive consultant at Snowden Optiro, and he's based here in Perth. He was a former employee and director of both Snowden and Optiro, and he has also extensive industry experience, as you guys know. At Snowden, Ian's currently focused on training, resource reviews and audits, and he specializes in reconciliation training and studies. Ian has carried out reconciliation reviews in Ghana, Zambia, West Australia, South Australia, and in South Africa, where I had the pleasure to meet him. In the past few years, he also contributed to the JORC code, reconciliation changes, and is being part of the working group there. Welcome, Ian. All yours.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a few minutes just introducing the topic. As I said to you, we're talking about specifically the reconciliation aspects of the JORC code. So I should declare my interest here in that I was part of a working group that defined some of this stuff, along with my colleague Mark Murphy in the front row here. And there was about 8 of us, and we basically put together some words which I think have more or less got into the JORC code unchanged. What I should say is that the key information is in 2 parts of the JORC code. I don't want to bore you with the text, it's there for reference. So this is section 10 of the code, which you can read. We don't need to go through it blow by blow. And we've also got the guidance notes, which is on the right there. And there's 2 bits there, page 36, which has got a bit of a blurb on reconciliation, and page 34 on reconciliation. Essentially, if I was to cut to the chase, we've got 2 types of reconciliation. One which we call prior estimate reconciliation, and this is where we're reconciling our resource and reserve as declared with the previous iterations of that, and that's been in the JORC code for quite a while. Then we have what we might call, or what is called, a production reconciliation, and where we have a producing operation, the CP, the competent person, as part of the annual statement, is required to provide a production reconciliation for both mineral resources and ore reserves. We'll talk about what exactly that means. But the purpose of the change is really what we were trying to do as a working group and later through the JORC committee is to provide investors with a view on a couple of things. How is the reserve performing? Or more specifically, how is the depletion of the reserve performing against production? And that's one thing. And then the other thing is, has there been a big change in the resource and the reserve? If so, why has that been? Given that in some companies the resource to reserve conversion rate is very low. Sometimes it's only 30% or 20%. So the intention is to provide the investors or people that are interested in these sorts of things with a bit of a perspective on there. So before we go to the panel, I should say that the suggestion for this discussion was put together by Raylene Hargreaves. Raylene is the product owner for Reconciler and a principal consultant at Datamine, and it would be remiss of me not to mention that Datamine has a set of excellent solutions in the reconciliation space. So we're talking here about Reconciler, Centric and Mine Market. So I think we're doing it as well as anybody. Okay, so let's get some discussion going. So we've got a bit of a relaxed barroom setting here. That doesn't mean that you can throw glasses or swear or anything like that. So let's introduce the panel. And my first question to the panel is, we talked about our 2 types of reconciliation, and that's a previous estimate reconciliation and a production reconciliation. So what I would ask you, firstly, Emma, is what is the importance of these 2 styles of reconciliation within your organisation?
Do I press something? Does it speak? I don't know.
Is it on?
Hello? Okay. Right now. So in Northern Star, we absolutely do both types of reconciliation, model-to-model reconciliation and production reconciliation, whatever that actually might mean. They are, I guess, serving 2 very different purposes as well. One is solely based on the model and the performance of the model and the addition of new data, whether that new data is extending the model or infilling and actually changing what was there previously. while the production does include a lot of additional factors as well, and those modifying factors that need to get reconciled. I suppose the one thing within the code, just to go off-piste for 1 second, is the description of reconciliation as being the comparison of two things to another. Within the Northern Star reconciliation guideline, we've added to the end of that in order to improve it. So we do reconciliation to make it better, not to kind of just tell someone about it. So we do our reconciliations so that we can improve.
Thank you. Yeah, I think similar sort of comments, I guess, from an iron ore perspective, the impact assessment of when we do one model to another model, we're looking at what has changed. And in an iron ore context, I guess, where it's not a single mine producing a single product, it's an integrated operation. So you've got multiple mines that are feeding into a logistics supply chain, which then produces a blended product at the end of that. And often a change at one mine can impact the way you mine at another mine, because you're trying to produce that blended product. So from an impact assessment perspective, that's an extremely important part of the process, is understanding those changes and why it's changed. Is it new drilling? Is it new geological into whatever the reason might be? So that's obviously a very important aspect from that side. And then obviously the reconciliation against production, and again, we need to define that term production. That's something that needs to look at, and I know we'll probably get to that at some point. But that's obviously where we want some confidence that what we're putting into our models is actually going to actually be produced through the process plants and at the other end, and ultimately put on a ship. And get some confidence that what we are planning to do ultimately is achievable. And that's from a when you think about a JORC code perspective, from a what are we trying to do here? That's all about investors. You're trying to provide information to those investors. You're trying to provide that confidence to those investors that the ore reserve that you're putting forward and that your market guidance for the financial year is an achievable market guidance. So when we say we're going to do X amount of tons for the year, or ounces, or whatever it is, that they can have that confidence in that.
Thanks very much. Oh, sorry, used the wrong one. First of all, I'd just like to make a disclaimer. I'm here today not in my BHP capacity, but as my personal. I'm just a person with an interest in these things. So that allows me to. Oh, there we go. We've got the same disclaimer from our Fortescue friend here. So that's very good. That's out of the way. Obviously, I won't say anything commercially sensitive or contrary to the interests of my company, but I'm speaking for myself, which is why I'm so disappointed to hear I'm not allowed to swear.
Agreed.
Yeah. So the question was all about the separation into prior estimate against production reconciliations, and I think it's. I really have to congratulate those people that put these words together, because this shows very, very clear thinking. So often I come across statements like, the recons are out, what's wrong? And until you start really carefully defining what things are and separating your estimates and your measurements out and defining and compartmentalising that value chain, you're really just left with a unstructured question. I'll also just throw in a little editorial comment, is that no person, if they're calculating assuming you're calculating reconciliations correctly, and you've got all the measurements and all the data's flowing correctly, no mining company has ever had a reconciliation problem. Ever. You might have a grade control problem, or an estimation problem, or a geological interpretation problem. So a lot of people come to me and say, we've got a recons problem. I go, no, you've got a problem that your reconciliations are highlighting, to your point. Anyway, so I really like the whole concept of prior estimate, which is focusing on one generation of the model to the next generation of the model to the next generation of the model. Because if a person bought shares in 2010, presumably they want to be able to see whether that reserve has shrunk or not, whether the estimation is putting new information in that's reducing the value of the asset that they've bought into, compared to the second question, which is when we dig this thing out of the ground, can we deliver the value that is represented in that reserve? So really, really important assurance activity for our shareholders, and a well thought out document, I thought.
Thank you. So just focusing on the actual language and the terminology itself, and again, I'll ask all three of you the same question. Within your organisations, and maybe Steve, you can speak for the company that you work for sometimes, would you say that there is a common reconciliation language across all of your sites? In other words, are you using the same language and corporate standards? And does this follow what I would call de facto standards? So de facto standards is probably what we call the F series. Now, we don't want to really go into that, but that is the de facto standard. So, Jenna, let me ask you, Emma, first. Is it standardised across NSR?
Theoretically, yes, it is. We have a standard document. Whether every site completes it in exactly the same way and we're doing everything exactly the same way, we're still evolving with that. After the merge of Saracen and Northern Star 3-4 years ago, with 3 companies that merged with 3 very different ways of doing things. So we are still evolving that. And trying also to bring our engineering brethren along the journey with us as well, which isn't as easy as one would think or hope. But essentially, every site is completing reconciliations. We're delivering and reporting on the same stuff, whether or not they're all to the same quality, and done the same way is an evolving piece.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I'd say we have similar language within the business at different operations. I think sometimes there's probably an education piece within the business in terms of, again, it's that definition side of things. When we reconcile the same things at each site in general, but often the way people talk about that within the business is often quite different, and people talk about at one site, the way they're talking about it, you sort of get the picture that they're talking about something different compared to the other site. And they sort of, at one site they might be talking about production and they're actually talking about what's coming out of the processing plant, whereas at the other site they're talking about production, but it's actually ex-pit haulage. And so that can get quite confusing, and that sort of comes into the definition. I think that's one area that, from a JORC code perspective, is probably to some extent lacking a little bit, is some of the definitions within the whole code. And it's not just reconciliation, it's across a lot of other areas, modifying factors and things like that. I think the code's expanded an awful lot. I think it's now up to 50 pages, and they've taken the guidance notes out. So it's probably doubled in size, if you like, from what it used to be. So those definitions are something that's quite challenging within the business. And then I think also that sort of maybe going off track, the way people do some ad hoc reconciliation. So we have standards that we do on a monthly basis, but then we often get, something's gone wrong locally within a pit. And then you get these little projects, if you like, that someone's done. And as soon as you start looking at it, you can see there's a very clear lack of understanding of what they're actually trying to do there. And, you're comparing one model to another model, but they're totally different block sizes. So you can see and immediately there's going to be a volume variance aspect that's a problem there, selectivity issue that's going to be a problem. So there's a bit of an education piece, I think, and that's probably fairly common at different levels across different sites, I'd imagine. But we do have a framework that is being developed. It's sort of based off loosely, I'd say, the F-factor style, which is the Harry Parker style concept. I think it's that whole value chain and the different measures across that value chain, but yeah, very similar.
So we at BHP do have a standard, and I was the lead author on it. Wow, that's the highlight of my career. However, I would have to say, if I was being completely honest, and speaking for myself, not for the company, I did like what you said. Theoretically, we do. I know the uptake of this, I think we might see an acceleration of the uptake now that this has come along. Look, I really love this question, and I hope you've got until 9 o'clock tonight because I'm going to be talking still then. Terminology is so important in this stuff. First of all, if you'll allow me to ramble a little bit, I'm going to give you 4 words that have multiple definitions that cause endless confusion. And those 4 words are reconciliation, which means about 5,000 different things. Model, which means many different things. Block, which is used for just about everything. And recovery. So if somebody says, I want to know what the block model reconciles against the model, they've really asked you pretty much nothing because there's no clarity in that terminology whatsoever. They have to be specific. And there's a very large part of my rather deformed personality that is a complete pedant. And so I angrily get them to clarify what it is they are saying. Muzza can tell you about this. And by the time we've spent a quarter of an hour talking about working out what the question was they've asked me, I can actually give them an answer. Now, the quick way around this is to have predetermined factors. And the factors that we have at BHP are F1, which is, in very brief terms, is a measurement over an estimate. And the F1 is the estimate, which is the estimate goes on the bottom, and that's the long-range model, what we would call the reserve, against the model that controls extraction, which is our final best estimate of what's in the ground. And that ratio is always expressed as a ratio, never as a percentage. And then F2 is effectively, and that's within the volume depleted, and then F2 is the same thing, the measurement over the estimate, and the estimate is that which comes from the grade control model, the model that controls extraction, compared to what was delivered to the plant, according to the plant's measurements. And that so the first one gives you an indication of how much the current reserve model had to be altered to turn into an extractable form, and then from the extraction model to the plant gives you an indication of how efficiently we mined and delivered that material. So these factors are very carefully and very clearly defined, and they are standardised across the business. And if I can just, I will be quick, I will just say one more thing. The only problem with these predeformed factors is it doesn't matter how many you have, someone wants another one. Someone will tell you that that factor is not the factor that they need, which is to your point, that you get these localised specialist projects that say, I've calculated an F2, but I've done it a special way. And the moment you've done it a special way, it's no longer an F2. It's an F2 something else because it's no longer in the standard. Transparency is one of the principles of the JORC code. When you're calculating these things, you have to be when you're reporting on these things, I think it's going to be really incumbent on whoever's reporting them to be as transparent and as crystal clear as possible with what your numbers are and what those numbers mean. And you'll have to be pedantic about the way you do it.
Thanks, Steve. I'm often reminded of the fable of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is a story where some people decided to build a tower to speak to God, and God wasn't very happy with this, so he gave them the gift of languages. They're all speaking different languages. They couldn't communicate with each other. Sometimes I feel that within some companies, not these companies, but within some companies, people are talking about different things, so we're on the Tower of Babel. Anyway, so look, one thing I wanted to get onto, and we've talked about it a few times, and you can see it on the screen behind me, is this idea of production. You'll see in section 10.1 there, it talks about reconciliation against production results. Now, again, I'd like to ask the panel exactly what they mean, what they think it means, and how it should be defined, if at all. Emma.
What I think the JORC are referring to, I don't know. It should be referring to both, because where you are in the value chain is really important. If you're not actually processing your material, it has to be based on production out of the mine.
So what's production there?
So material out of the mine, and that would be ore and waste. If you're just developing along an ore drive, the engineers should be absolutely understanding dilution and recovery in an ore drive just as much as they are in a stope. And that's what the engineers should be concerned about when it gets to the plant, understanding the gold bars that are coming out. The Mets should be concerned about that and that reconciliation production through the mill. So it's I'm presuming intentionally vague, but it is very, very vague, and it should cover everything. If we're actually trying to be transparent with a shareholder, I suppose we're telling them everything that is happening within the mine. So it should cover both material out of the mine and through the plant or onto the ship, or when they've made the steel. I don't know what happens in iron ore, but
Yeah, I think we've got to remember that we're talking about reconciliation within the JORC code context, right? And so what's the JORC code all about? It's all about public reporting. And what are we public reporting for? Well, it's to inform investors. So we're talking about production from an investor sense. Now, for the context of like Fortescue or an iron ore company, in that sense, production for us is what goes on a ship, because that is what's generating revenue. You know, from an investor point of view, they want to know what is generating revenue. Now, that's for us, that's production on a ship. For gold operation, to me, that's going to be ounces, you know, that use gold bars, you know, from that perspective. Now, we're going to have other reconciliation measures that we're going to talk, you know, that you can talk about, and all these different factors and things. But from a JORC code perspective, I think that probably needs to be defined to some extent, in the sense that the JORC code is really reconciling against the ore reserve, and it's reconciling, to me, what that production is what the shareholders are interested in, which is what is revenue, which for us, tons on ship. Have you got a different view?
Yeah, totally agree. No, I don't have a different view. I'll just go into that a little bit further. So I think production in the JORC context is first saleable product, first commercially saleable product. And this actually, again, when we were working on there were a group of us working on this BHP standard, and this particular question generated a lot of discussion, because we were talking about nickel. The Nickel West's final product was, you know, a nickel matte or whatever. It had been through all these processing, but all these multiple processing processes that we were going to have to measure and quantify and make an estimate for, and then adjust the estimate. And essentially they said, look, by the time that it goes on the rail, it's a nickel concentrate that we could sell. We could realistically sell that. It's a saleable product at that point. We want to reconcile at that point where we have a commercial product. And we said, yes, because you've gone from this thing being an entity in the ground, you've converted it into something that's commercially valuable. In iron ore, it's simple, because once it's screened into lump and fines, it's saleable. In nickel, there's a long, long production chain that comes after that first saleable product. So we define production as first saleable product. Now, having said that, there is one more complication, and that is then the mining guys said, well, let's say if the mill or the mill recovery is not good, we want to be able to get an insight into how we're converting our reserve to delivering it to processing, independently of how well the processing plant is recovering. So there's a thing called F3, which is saleable product against reserve, given the hole in the ground that we've mined. And we actually generated two F3s. One was an F3 pre-mill, which is what was your measurement, what was your estimate to the mill, and then an F3 post-mill, which took your best estimate of recovery into account, mill recovery into account. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I think I'd take the view that, yes, you're producing stuff from the mine, and essentially it goes to 4 different locations. Some of it goes to the waste dump, some of it goes to the stockpile, some of it goes to the product, gold bars, and some of it's in the plant. So I would define, and I think it is deliberately vague, I would define production as the total product, which is, I think, pretty well what you were all saying. But I think it's going to be important that if the code doesn't make it any clearer, and remember, we do have the opportunity to suggest changes. I think it's important that whenever we, as reconciliation people, are doing this, we do actually define what's meant by production. If we just say stuff out of the mine, well, you could argue that stuff out of the mine hasn't gone through the plant, so you don't really know what it is. Or you could say it's the stuff, as Steve's saying, the product, the saleable product, plus, in my mind, the tails, what's in the plant and maybe what's in stockpiles. Emma said to me earlier on that at KCGM, there's how many years? 20 years stuff on the stockpile. So to work out the reconciliation at KCGM, you really need to know what's on the stockpile. So that's a bit of a problem, and it's going to be a problem as long as we're doing reconciliation. So I think the important thing is when you're doing it is to define what you're actually meaning by production. Remember that we're not actually seeing the grade control model, right? Remember, even though you're all doing grade control models, or most of you, JORC's not interested in that. JORC's interested in from the shareholder perspective, the resource depletion and the reserve depletion. So if we're just talking about the grade control model, that's from one point of view, that's not so relevant. Okay, so one thing I just wanted to ask you about, and this is going into in the JORC code, whether it's in the guidance section, is this idea that we're taking our mine call factor and we're then applying that as a factor to our reserves. Now, before I ask the panel, can I just see a show of hands if you work for a company where you're actually factoring your reserves based on the mine call factor for the previous year? Is anybody doing that? Goldfields doing it, IGO's doing it, Fortescue's doing it. Okay, but no one else. Okay, that's interesting. So maybe Emma can comment on that, the idea of the application of factors, which is not doing at Northern Star. I didn't see any Northern Star hands going up.
I guess it's the engineers who are doing the reserves. I did have a chat with our technical services manager yesterday, though, and asked him about it. So mine call factors are taken into consideration in terms of they'll look back at previous production periods. And you know, if we find we've been getting more tons out of a mine, they will absolutely factor that in, unless we have made adjustments to try and make it better, so we don't have to factor. In terms of the performance through the plant, that's not taken into account. A lot of our mills, well, KCGM, the biggest mill, is mine constrained, or mill constrained. So most of that resource is actually left on the surface. So you can't comment on whether actually the resource is performing as expected. So we do, but not. I suppose there's not just one number.
Yeah. So we actually do, to some extent, take into account the reconciliation into our the recon into to your point, but we do take that into account in our mine planning process when we generate the mining model. There are obviously part of the modifying factors is actually you're using some form of a reconciliation to make some adjustment to some of those values in the blocks in terms of usually related to tons.
So is the reserve as reported? Has that been factored?
It has the recons applied to those within the factors. Now it's what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide the best prediction of what is going to be delivered to the processing plant or to the ROM, if you like, for that. Now, you've got to remember in most iron ore operations, you're dealing with a massive logistical movement of tons. And it's we're a 100% rehandle operation as well. So you've got this massive stockpiling operation where you actually lose track of a lot of it. It's very difficult to track it. You're trying to reconcile. If we ideally in the JORC code here, we're talking about ore reserves back to this concept of production. Now, it's very hard to link that often back to the individual mines because you're dealing with a blended product on a stockpile going through a rail system that's then gone through a process plant. If you go working backwards, it's been rehandled in a stockpile all the way back to the model. It makes it very difficult to reconcile all the way through that value chain and track it individually. So it kind of has to be, to some extent, fairly global. Now, having said that, you've got to be really careful in the intent of trying to adjust your ore reserves in that sense, because what are you trying to achieve here? You don't want to factor your way out of a problem. That's not the intent. The idea here is just, if there is a big problem, you need to try and fix that. And on your point around improvement in the recon, so we will try to make sure that those factors are long-term factors, because we're trying to deal with life of mine plans, long-term 10-year plus plans here. So you're trying to make sure that you're not banking on an area to deliver a certain amount of tons when you know that, you know, potentially you're not going to get those tons, or you're going to get more tons, if, you know, depending on how that recon looks, how that comparison looks. So we do that, but again, you've got to be careful. Your intent is not to factor to hide an issue. Your intent is to provide a best estimate of what's delivered at the ROM, and not to adjust like that. So if you're finding you're adjusting too much, and what's the definition of too much? Well, how long's a piece of string? But that's probably where it's going a bit too far in that sense, and it's a difficult one. But I think, sorry, Steve, I think this is an area that I think probably needs some thought, because, you know, we're trying to, from a JORC code context, we're trying to put the reconciliation in front of investors to say, you know, this is how the ore reserve is translated into revenue at the end of the day. But how are those investors going to be interpreting that, and how are those investors going to be using that information? Now, if you've already, to some degree, compensated the ore reserve to factor in that reconciliation, then I think we got to be careful on how the investors then are going to interpret and use that. Because if we, for argument's sake, an operation says that, you know, our recons are 5% over. So in other words, you're saying that you're going to get 5% more tons or 5% more ounces, whatever it is. Is an investor then going to go through and say, oh, well, they've announced 100 million tonne reserve, it's actually 105 million tonne because I can just add 5% onto that? You know, we've got to be a bit careful of how the investors potentially will interpret that, and how they're going to use that information, because it is a very complex subject. You know, it's not necessarily that your estimate's wrong, it could be a moisture factor. You know, very simply, it could be, you know, 100 million different reasons why your recon could show some difference there.
I am very proud to say that across the whole of BHP, it is verboten to change the reserve model on the basis of a reconciliation. Each F-series reconciliation is to be calculated entirely agnostic of the prior one. There is no response for any one of our operations, F1, F2, F3. This quarter will have no direct mathematical impact on the F1, F2, F3 from next quarter. We do not change the model. Now, having said that, we calculate these factors. We do not apply these factors. We don't write that information back into the model, because to your point about improving, we are of the view, well, there's 2 points. First is, you could argue, as you quite rightly said, it's the start of a slippery slope. But our view is that if you apply a correction factor, you lose any ability, or you reduce your ability to discern what the true root cause of the problem is, and hence you are taking one step further away from solving the root cause of the problem. However, having said that, we aren't completely squeaky clean, because we do use that information, particularly the F2, will inform a bias that can be informed to the plans, to the mine plans. So the mine plans might say, okay, given the hole in the ground that we plan to mine, we think we're going to get, 60% iron. But historically, we know we always get 0.5% less than or whatever the number might be, And typically, we generally find we get a few more tons at a slightly lower grade. So that intelligence, that business intelligence, will find its way into the mine plan and potentially the budget, but it does not find its way into the model. And I would say I think that's good practice to not apply the factor into the model.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, as a consultant, I'm only a humble consultant, but I did work for a big mining company once. I would agree. I would never do it, but I acknowledge that for various reasons, companies do it, as we've seen. So look, I'd like to give the audience a chance to ask some questions or comment. So let's do that.
My turn, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go easy on us, mate.
Go easy. Look, I really like the fact you brought up the point that mine production results is ambiguous, because when we're putting that together, I thought it was quite clear. But perhaps it should say mine production results of saleable product, and I do like that terminology. And I think that works in any operation. I understand the problem with products at mines, but basically your saleable product at the mine, the only best measure you've got is the belt cutter going into the radial stacker stockpile, and that's really the mine gate product, right? And that was the sort of thing I used to see at Rio.
It could also be sold product, or it could be product presented for sale. But
Yeah.
I think saleable product is the best. There are, you can cut it, anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but yeah.
I think one thing there though as well that's probably missing from the definition is that it talks about as part of the annual review, which presumably then you're talking about the 12 months worth of recon. But it doesn't actually say that. So are you actually, do you want to, what time frame are we talking about? Do you want to go back how far? You know, is it just the last 12 months of production that we're talking about in the process? So I think it's implied, but it's not. It's open for interpretation. You could easily put a 3-year rolling average in there if you want, or something like that. But then you've also got the aspect that you've got to be careful of, which is if you're dealing with a fairly short, and you argue that 12 months is probably not a short time frame, but in some operations that could be. You could have some local features that, 1 year it could be quite not terribly good, and the next year it could be completely the other way, and that might be just local aspects.
That's great too, because that's another ambiguity of words things, because the intent of the annual review is that you at least present the reconciliation annually, not necessarily the last year. So I think that's some good feedback you could give. That needs to be made clear, that you're just doing this annually, and leave it at that. The other thing is, much as I loved Harry's effing factors, I think they've got no bearing on what we're trying to achieve in this reporting here. I guess we'll agree to disagree, because the intent of the JORC code, as John said, is to inform investors. And when we say investors, we're talking about all those analysts who have spreadsheets of your mines and models and put numbers into them. And my understanding of the intent of the JORC code is to provide those people with information that allows them to predict. So if, for example, you've got a ore reserve that's out of kilter and under and over predicts, they'll still put those numbers into their spreadsheets. And if you're giving them an unscaled or uncorrected number, they'll be informing investors with the wrong information, right? Because they will use those numbers. And the reason why I was really keen to have a mineral resource and an ore reserve number is because these guys run their spreadsheets to the end of the ore reserve, and then they run it through the mineral resource going forward, okay? And so if you're applying a factor correction from your mineral resource to your ore reserve, and you're stating that quite clearly, and you're stating that the ore reserve has been adjusted based on the best current knowledge to accurately predict, hopefully over a quarterly period going forward, or at least annually. And then if the investor advisors are starting to model resources, you say, hang on a minute, if you're using those, you need to factor those grades down by 10% or the tonnes up by 3. You're actually being more transparent to the market than just giving them a number and saying, well, we're not going to touch these because we think they're good enough, but actually we're not actually telling you that number is possibly wrong. So while I understand that your idea is that you shouldn't muck with the numbers, I don't think you're being transparent by doing that, if you can see my argument there.
No,
Anybody else
I
want to
don't
go?
see
I'm
the
going to talk
argument.
all afternoon. Come on.
I mean, no, I don't see the argument. I don't understand why you would alter the model, not understanding, if you truly don't understand why you're getting more tonnes at a lower grade, why would you change the model? And you're obscuring the matter of analysis for yourself. That model is a technical thing upon which your resource and reserve statement is based. What you could do, if you went down that path, you could use the model to generate a pure model-based reserve statement, and then to that add a historical adjustment to those numbers, but there's no requirement to alter the model to generate that.
Oh, look, agreed, and that's what we do. We generate an ore reserve, but then as a modifying factor, as a reconciliation adjustment. So what's reported to the market
Yes,
is
that's,
the
that's
adjusted
correct,
number.
but it does not require an alteration to the model, which is, as I understand it, was what the question was.
Maybe I wasn't clear. It does require an alteration to the model as the last step before it's reported to the market.
Well, I know we're being pedantic again, but that's not an alteration to the model. That's an alteration to the numbers that were generated by the analysis of the model.
Well, it depends whether you think a reconciliation is the same as any other modifying factor, such as metallurgical recovery, yield.
Well, it wouldn't be I don't think you'd call it a reconciliation factor. I'd suggest you'd call it a historical performance adjustment.
Oh, we'll just, yeah. Well, same thing. If you want to call it that, I'm happy with that as well. as long as you're reporting to the market what's actually going to be produced.
Another point I think that probably we need to think about here as well is, you know, most companies, and again, this is my personal opinion, but I think one area that we might be an unintended consequence of some of this is that you drive some poor market behaviour, because most companies, you know, we all sort of understand that positive recon, if you talk about, you know, plus 5% versus a negative recon, negative 5%, are both equally problematic, or 10%, whatever the number is. But from a market perspective, most people will be, you know, oh, we got 5% more ounces than we said, therefore it's sweet, that's great. Not many people are going to want to report that we got 5% less ounces or less tonnes.
Or 10% less.
Or 10% less, right? So they're going to be now, could that potentially, and, you know, drive some poor behaviour, and where you're going to drive companies to sort of, okay, well, let's just play with the moisture factors or whatever it happens to be, that we can make this work, if that makes sense. I think it's a risk that's there.
Yeah, I suppose the code is based on the principles of transparency, competency, and materiality, and you can hide a lot in those three. If you're going to be a crook and you want to pull the wool over your investors' eyes, you're going to find a way to do that, regardless of what the code says.
Is that in your modelling or in what you're reporting?
Well,
and that's the risk.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's about integrity, isn't it? It's about making this as clear as you possibly can and as honest as you can. I've seen some, in my time before BHP, I've seen some practices done in reconciliations that were, in my view, bordering on criminal. You know, there was just numbers that were being generated specifically for the purposes of looking very, very favourable.
We all have, yeah, definitely.
And, yeah, making these numbers compulsory to declare, as you've quite rightly said, could conceivably drive some very questionable practices.
I'm getting the wrap up, but just in closing, I'd just like to say that I wouldn't underestimate the magnitude of these changes. I mean, there's lots of codes around the world. None of them really encourage you to talk about production reconciliation. I mean, most of them talk about previous estimate reconciliation. So what we're attempting to do here as an industry in Australia is it's a big change, and it's something that's going to take some time to filter through the system. So it's, you know, I would not underestimate the magnitude of the changes. So look, I'd like you to thank our panel for a very, very good job. Thank you.